Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nancy Wodralgo, State Specialist in Community and Economic Development with University of Illinois Extension. We're happy to host another Illinois Broadband Lab webinar in our series for the BEAD Challenge. And today we'll cover more on the process for BEAD Challenge and information on preparations for eligible entities. We're happy to welcome Matt Schmidt, Deputy Director for Broadband with the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Happy as well to give a big welcome to Devin Brownstein, our new Assistant Director of the Office of Broadband. And welcome back to Shabika Agarwal with the Illinois Broadband Lab. And last but not least, Alexis Shrub, Director of the Internet Equity Initiative at University of Chicago. We want to thank you all for your time, and we're grateful for the information and expertise of this panel as we engage and lean in and try to do our best across the state to ensure proper investment in broadband access. So without further delay, I'll pass it on to you, Matt. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another conversation today about the BEAD challenge process, how we're able to lock in the map to make it as realistic and accurate as possible before we start our round 4 of the Connect Illinois grant program that will leverage BEAD funds. And so I know we've had a series of webinars in October, November, now December. We really want to work with you to bring this opportunity to life and to put Illinois in a position to get the most out of the challenge process and the BEAD investment that follows. And so today, what we'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about the BEAD program overview, revisit our approach in our plans for the challenge process and how we'd like to engage with stakeholders and providers and communities across the state. Third, and importantly, how you can participate in this program. And then fourth, next steps, what you can anticipate in the weeks ahead as we prepare to open the challenge process and move into the new year. And so importantly, we want to leave you with a firm understanding of what we want to accomplish and where we want you to be following today's webinar. First, we want you to know what the BEAD challenge process is, what it's about, and why it's important, and how you can be involved, whether you're a local government, a nonprofit, a provider, an Illinoisan, a resident living anywhere in the state. This is an important process. There's a path forward for you to participate, and we want to support you in participating. Secondly, we want you to be familiar with the preparations that we're taking and that you can take as an eligible entity, including pre-registration, different types of challenges, and the evidence that's required, and then understanding and using the FCC fabric. Again, that's available for the Federal Communications Commission, the broadband serviceable locations. We'll get into more of that in a moment. And then finally, we want you to feel increasingly ready to take the next steps for the challenge process. We know that this is high stakes. There's a lot going on here in terms of broadband and digital equity and your own commitments to work and life. But this is a very unique opportunity we have to perfect the map or get it as strong as we can in terms of its accuracy before we move forward with the BEAD program. We want to support you in participating in this mapping challenge process. So in terms of all the work that is coming together here, we've invested a lot in the last year in community outreach and engagement, a very ambitious 54-stop statewide listening tour, virtual and in-person engagement that followed. A lot of that work combined with deep data analytics informed our 5-year action plan, which basically showed the path forward for how we plan on putting these pieces together. In the fall, we opened a public comment period for initial proposal volume 1, how we plan on running the challenge process, defining community anchor institutions, etc. And then we also are in the process of incorporating public comment into initial proposal volume 2. We'll be submitting both of those to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, for their approval. And so a lot of that planning, that proposal development, based in our community outreach and engagement, talking to stakeholders, we're moving forward, making great progress. Once initial proposal volume 1 is approved by NTIA, and we expect that approval in the coming weeks, we can open up our challenge process. We anticipate this challenge process to run mid-January through March. And so there's a little bit of flexibility here on our part. There's a little bit of unknown in terms of when exactly NTIA is going to approve our initial proposal volume 1, but we feel very confident that we're able to open that challenge process in mid-January. And that's why we're investing in this engagement right now. And then finally, when the challenge process is complete, and we've been approved by NTIA for our Volume 2 proposal. We get through administrative rulemaking here with the Illinois General Assembly. We're able to open up the subgrantee selection process through a notice of funding opportunity that the state will administer. We expect that that will open up sometime in spring 2024, maybe April or May. And so that will extend throughout the year ahead and into 2025. And so with that said, we can turn the slide. And I would like to take this opportunity to formally introduce the new Assistant Deputy Director for Broadband for the state of Illinois, Devin Bronstein. A lot of you know Devin from her great work at the city of Chicago. Welcome to our team, Devin, and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Really excited to be here. So as Matt shared, I came from the city of Chicago and now excited to work with all of you statewide. So hopefully I see some familiar faces in the audience. So if you've ever attended a presentation by me, you know that I think that the basic terms and definitions are really, really important. Before we go into the relatively complex challenge process and federal requirements, it's really key to just hone in on what do these basic terms means, so we're all on the same page going forward. So I think many of you probably saw a slide like this in the webinar last week, so let's consider this a review, and if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, since this is kind of baseline important information. So the first term is a broadband serviceable location, otherwise known as a BSL. And what this basically means is a location in the US, so in our context in Illinois, in which you can get mass market fixed broadband internet access service, or it can be installed. Then you have the three definitions that characterize a location's current broadband access. When something is unserved, that means it doesn't have access to any broadband. So 25/3 megabits per second is how the federal government defines broadband. If an area or a location is unserved, it has no access to broadband. If it's underserved, that's the next tier up. So this means that a location may have access to those basic 25/3 megabits per second broadband, but it doesn't have access to what many people consider a higher quality, higher speed access, which is 100/20 megabits per second. And another way that underserved can be defined is if a location's latency is greater than 100 milliseconds. And we'll get more into that throughout the presentation. Finally, if a location is served, that means that it has broadband speeds of at least 100/20 megabits per second or higher. Next, community anchor institution. You may have heard this term, a CAI. This is going to be defined more specifically by the state, but at the highest level, it's any sort of institution, whether that's a nonprofit or a library, that provides some sort of critical service or support to residents, particularly folks in underrepresented communities. Multi-dwelling unit, this is basically an apartment building, so a structure with multiple but separate housing units. And finally, latency, I mentioned this before. This is the time it takes data to go to a server and back to your connection. And so what this means in tangible terms is if you have latency that is too high, your video meetings might be choppy or freeze. So you're really looking for latency that is 100 milliseconds or lower. So next we'll do a high-level overview of the BEAD program, really a recap, and then we'll go into the challenge process. So what is the goal of BEAD? Illinois was awarded over $1 billion to connect all unserved and underserved locations to quality broadband over the next 5 years. It prioritizes use of fiber whenever possible. It prioritizes unserved and underserved locations first, and then community anchor institutions and those multi-dwelling units. Like Matt shared, over the first year of the program, the goal is to select all of the grantees who will actually implement the broadband and then complete that implementation over the next 4 years. And finally, there is an affordability piece here. So every option will be required to have a low income option and then a middle class affordability plan. All right, let's get into the BEAD challenge process. And again, some of these slides might look a little familiar if you've attended a bunch of these webinars, but kind of honing in on the basic information that everyone needs to know. So let's get Illinois' map right. what is the basic purpose of this challenge process? We are trying to get as accurate of a map as possible for the state of Illinois. And to back up a little bit, the federal government had developed a broadband map, but the problem is that coverage in some areas may be overstated. So what this means is that there could be locations on the map that are indicated as having broadband, but they may not actually have broadband in reality, or their speeds may not be as high quality as indicated on the map. So this is a window of opportunity for us to refine it further to make sure it's accurate. And the reason why this is critically important right now is that how a location is classified on the map is tied to its eligibility for funding, specifically these BEAD dollars or funding for broadband infrastructure. So to break it down even further, the purpose of the challenge process is to ensure that the state broadband map accurately reflects your home or organization's access to broadband to inform which locations are eligible for funding. Only certain entities can actually submit challenges, and these are units of local government, whether that's a school district or a library district, a county government, nonprofit organizations, and internet service providers. The state is also really excited that individuals will have the chance to participate as well through an online speed testing tool that we'll show a little bit later, and potentially through local governments and nonprofits. What can be challenged? We're also going to share a map that will be rolled out in January that has updated locations, and everything on that map will be challengeable. This includes those broadband serviceable locations or BSLs, as well as community anchor institutions that are being added to the map thanks to your feedback as we speak. The timing is we're looking at roughly mid-January, and the process could run for between 2 and 4 weeks, but all of that is kind of TBD based on the federal government approval. So a high-level look at what the challenge process will be. First is the pre-registration phase, which is happening now. So there's something you can do right after this meeting to make sure that you're participating. I'll talk about that on the next slide. Then in early January, the map I mentioned will be live. And so you can actually go in before the challenge process opens and take a look at locations, your home, your business, your local nonprofit, to see how they might be categorized on the map and whether you're going to be submitting a challenge. Then the challenge process will be officially open, where you'll have the chance to actually submit evidence. Once the challenge process closes, it's the rebuttal phase. And so internet service providers may look at the challenges and submit a correction to say, actually, we do offer service here. Adjudication, this is where the state broadband office goes back and evaluates the challenges, the rebuttals, and comes to a happy medium of sort of the reality. And then finally, the final map will be published. And again, this will inform the grant process to come. So we recognize that this challenge process is complex. And so I'm really excited about this piece, this sort of policy decision that the state made to make it a little bit easier and take the burden off of residents. So what we've done is already characterize certain locations as eligible for funding. The first is locations with DSL internet connections, and DSL is connection through copper phone lines. So this is known to be a lower quality connection that could use upgrading to fiber service or higher quality service. So locations that are served by DSL are already going to be considered underserved. Next is multi-dwelling units. So the state identified close to 340 multi-dwelling unit buildings, again, those apartment buildings that should already be considered unserved based on the service that is available. And so residents in these buildings won't need to submit anything. They'll already be considered unserved, so eligible for funding. So an example of this is there is broadband that goes to the curb, but maybe not the individual units, or there's connection to the individual units, but they're in a state of disrepair, and so they can't support those 100/20 megabit per second speeds. And so I mentioned this broadband challenge map that will go live sometime in January. A couple of updates that you'll see. So again, households served by the DSL technology will say that they're eligible for funding. The multi-dwelling units that are classified as underserved will be updated as eligible for funding. And the map will reflect the latest Connect Illinois Round 3. So what this slide shows is the process of like, what does this actually look like? We've been talking about this challenge process. So we're starting to get a sneak peek into what these steps will look like. The first step is pre-registration. So you'll have an opportunity, if you haven't already, to submit basic information about who you are so you can be verified to participate in the actual challenge process. So this part is open now. The second step is you'll be able to access this broadband challenge map. Again, will be available in January to select a location or select a series of locations and carry that over to submit your challenge. And then finally, there will be a portal where you can upload evidence of your challenge. The screenshot in the middle is just a sneak peek, subject to change, but wanted to start giving you an idea of what this thing actually looks like. So to go into pre-registration briefly, you probably have already received this link, but it's very easy to pre-register, and it's actually required for two reasons. One, to receive important up-to-date communication about the challenge process, such as important dates, resources, updates, and two, identity verification. So a challenge can be submitted by one of those three entities I shared earlier, and the office needs to know who is actually submitting the challenge. So pre-registering just helps us verify your information before the actual challenge process opens. So you can see some of the fields on the right. This is just an example, and the form will look different based on whether you select that you're a nonprofit, a government entity, an internet service provider, or an individual. And final note on pre-registration, these are some of the fields that you'll need to have handy to submit your pre-registration form. You can see it's different based on who you are. Relatively straightforward, but let us know if you run into any issues. And I think we got a question last time, if you submitted something and you wanted to change your response, just go ahead and resubmit the information, and the team will deduplicate all the responses and just take your latest submission. And so with that, I will hand it over to Shubika to talk about details of challenge process and evidence.
Sure. Thanks, Devin. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining again today. So again, this might be a familiar slide. We're going to start with looking at the different challenge types, moving on to the different evidence requirements for each of these different challenge categories. So starting off with the different sections that these challenge types can be categorized into. So firstly, for the broadband serviceable locations, challenges can be made based on availability, speed, latency, data cap, technology, and whether it's only business service that's available at a particular location. Again, for each of these, we're going to take a deeper dive into what exactly that means and what are the different evidence requirements for challenge as well as rebuttal for each of these categories. The next one is the enforceable commitments or the planned service. So a user can challenge whether certain locations are part of planned service or not, whether they are part of enforceable commitments or not. So that includes various federal and state infrastructure funding programs that they might have already received awards from. And lastly, the CAI category, where users can challenge if a location is or is not a CAI, and also challenge the speeds that are available at that location, which is going to affect eligibility. So specifically for CAIs, eligibility is defined by access to at least gigabit symmetrical service at that location. So that makes it a little different for CAIs in terms of the speed that they have set for eligibility. So diving deep into the different evidence requirements for challenge and rebuttal, starting with the availability challenge type. So this is when one of the eligible entities or individuals through their local units of government or nonprofits really want to challenge whether that particular broadband service that's identified for that location is being offered or not. The different challenge evidences that can be shared for this kind of challenge would be a screenshot from the provider website. So we basically have one for reference here from Astound Broadband. It could depend on the provider that's actually reporting service at that location and you'd like to challenge. So directly going to their website and looking up if they do provide service at your location, that could be one category. If you've had correspondence with them about not receiving service within the last 180 days, if that's an email communication or a letter, that can also be used as evidence. If there's lack of suitable infrastructure for the particular service that's reported, that could be sufficient evidence for filing such a challenge. And again, if there's a letter or email within 365 days from the provider, that is sufficient evidence to submit as part of this category. The rebuttal from the ISP would essentially include that there's evidence for subscription at that location within the last 12 months or some sort of counter screenshot evidence which actually states that they do provide service at that location. Again, we have all of this information also mentioned in our initial proposal, volume 1. So for some of you who've already looked at that, it's available there, and we'll be sure to share more details here in the following slides as well. So moving on to the next challenge type, the speed category. So this is if a location's not receiving the speeds that is reported, and if they would in fact fall in the unserved or underserved categories. So one thing here that's important to note is that only subscribers who've subscribed to speeds greater than 100 by 20 would be able to change a location from served to underserved, and only subscribers who have subscribed to speeds greater than 25 by 3 will be able to, through their evidence, be able to change a location to unserved. So here again, there's a screenshot of a speed test, and we're going to we're going to take a deep dive into the essential requirements for speed tests and what that's going to look like, because there are certain requirements in terms of the number of times we're supposed to take the speed test and how that's supposed to be submitted. So we're going to look into that a little bit later. The rebuttal for this is again going to be any counter evidence from the provider which shows that the location does indeed receive the speeds that have been reported for that location. Similarly, for latency, as we discussed, it's basically the delay in action versus response. If it exceeds greater than 100 milliseconds, that is when it would be a successful challenge for that particular provider. So a speed test also includes information for latency, as it's a small screenshot here, but that information is included. So a speed test would again be one of the ways to submit a latency challenge. And if the internet service provider again has counter evidence that they have latency less than 100 milliseconds, that could be a rebuttal for that particular challenge type. Moving on to the next category, the data caps. So again, NTIU wants to ensure that there's reliable high-speed internet available at all, and data caps are not considered to be good, reliable, high-speed internet. So if there are locations that have data caps, that could be a successful challenge. You could incorporate screenshots from the provider web page that basically show that there is a data cap for the service that you've subscribed to, or if there's other service information shared by the provider that basically reflects that data cap, that's going to be sufficient evidence for this kind of challenge. The rebuttal is any evidence from the provider that shows that they do not impose that unreasonable data cap at that particular location. This is a lot of information. So as we're going about this, if we have specific questions on the evidence requirements and the process, please feel free to drop that into the chat. Moving on to the next category, the technology. So again, for each location, there is the ISP information, the speeds, and also the type of technology that they're providing at that location. So if the technology that's indicated for a particular location is inaccurate, that can also be challenged. We have a screenshot of an evidence example here. So it could be basically the gateway that you have at your home, which shows that service can only be accepted through a specific technology. That would be a good evidence for this kind of challenge. And again, if the provider has countervailing evidence that shows that they do provide the technology that's reported on the maps, that would be evidence that can be shared as part of the rebuttal process of the challenge. Then we have the business service only. So as the name suggests, if it's a residential location and the provider website states, or through previous communication, you know that there's only business service that's being offered at that location, this can be challenged through sharing a screenshot of the provider website. And yeah, the rebuttal is going to be any information that the provider can share that shows that they do offer residential service at that location as well. The next challenge category, so this might be more pertinent to internet service providers or local governments who have been actively engaged in their counties and working or in their communities to basically get internet service and infrastructure. So enforceable commitment, if the challenger has knowledge that there's going to be broadband that's going to be deployed in these particular locations through other federal and state programs, they could file this kind of challenge. So it's going to be maybe an authorization letter that they have for that kind of build that can be used as evidence for the challenge. And the rebuttal could be documentation that, you know, the provider has defaulted in providing the service that they had received the grant award for. The next category is planned service. So this is if the challenger has knowledge that broadband will be deployed at this location by June 30th, 2024. Again, this data is based on the challenge guidelines shared by NTIA. So Illinois has incorporated the same. And the evidence that could be used for this kind of challenge is basically if the internet service provider has, you know, construction contracts and has gone through all the different permits that they have to actually start building in that area and have service available by June 30th, 2024. That's going to be good enough evidence. If there is a binding agreement with the eligible entity, so in this case, the state, that could also be used as evidence. For the rebuttal, it would be documentation showing that they in fact might not be able to meet that commitment, or the build out does not really meet the BEAD eligibility requirements. So that is for planned service. And that's an important category, again, because we understand that there might be build outs happening in the state through various, you know, private service providers. So we definitely want to get that information as well, so that there's no duplication of funding that's happening in areas where there already might be planned service. So in the previous slide, we discussed enforceable commitments. So there's also this other challenge type, which is not part of enforceable commitments. So one thing that I also want to share here is we are going to be publishing a map that has a lot of this information. NTIA has shared a broadband funding map for the entire country, and that's essentially where a lot of this data comes from. But there's also going to be information on, you know, any other grant programs that might lead to, you know, infrastructure build out. So that information is going to be shared as part of the BEAD challenge map that the state is basically working towards. And so you'll have all of that information. So if there's a location that is indicated to be part of enforceable commitments, but in, you know, the challenger's knowledge that's not 100% accurate, that can be challenged based on, you know, any evidence or declaration that they have on their end. The next category, as we had discussed, the CAIs. So there's certain different challenge types that the CAIs can engage in, whether a location is or is not a CAI. So again, the challenge map that I referred to is going to have an updated list of all the CAIs that the state has identified as part of initial proposal volume 1. We also received a lot of really good feedback on the different categories and CAIs that we should be including. So we have been updating that list, and that's soon going to be published for everybody to look at. So there can be challenges in terms of whether a particular location falls within the definitions of the CAIs that the state has put forward, or it does not. And again, challenge and rebuttal would depend on the reasoning for why that shouldn't be included as part of CAI, and whether or not it falls within the definitions of CAIs defined by the state. In this sheet, again, looking at how you can challenge the eligibility of a CAI for BEAD funding. So that could be based on speed and availability. The evidence requirements, again, are same as the speed and availability challenge types that we had discussed earlier. But again, mentioning this separately for CAIs, because the speed criteria for eligibility of CAIs is different. They would be eligible for BEAD funding if they do not have access to symmetric gigabit service. So again, similar evidence requirements like the speed and availability categories for CAIs as well. The only thing to note would be the speed criteria for them. So I see we do have a few questions come in. We'll get to these towards the end of the presentation. In this section, we're going to talk about how to really participate in the challenge process. So in the next few slides, we're really going to take a deep dive into some of these questions. So what are the different data sources that can be used? So we definitely have the FCC Broadband Map. We have the FCC Broadband Funding Map, as I mentioned, that has information about the various federal grant awards across the country. But then there's also the Illinois BEAD challenge map that we're coming up with. So that's going to have information about a lot of these other categories, like we mentioned. So enforceable commitments, CAIs, all that represented on the map, so that it's easier for, communities who've not had the chance to get access to the to the CostQuest fabric, maybe to take a look at what the maps have to say about their location. So basically developing a tool that makes it easier to compile all of these different categories and get a sense of what the maps have to say for your location. Will additional challenges be triggered based on high frequency of challenges submitted in a certain area? So we do have the area and MDU challenges that we have incorporated as part of the challenge process. So we're going to take a closer look into what really happens when those are triggered. And one of the things about these is if an area or MDU challenge is triggered, the onus then basically falls on the provider to show that they provide service to all of those locations within that particular MDU or area being the census block group. So we'll get into specifics of that in the following slide as well. What evidence is required for speed challenges? So as I mentioned earlier, there are specific requirements in terms of what's really needed for speed challenge submission. There's requirements in terms of taking 3 speed tests on 3 different days. So we'll also have a demonstration of one of the tools that can help with this. And then some information on how local units of governments and nonprofits can really start to work with their communities, with individuals, and collect the data that can then be submitted as part of the challenge. So on the first question, engaging in the challenge process with the map and the challenge portal, it's important that each challenge be linked to a specific broadband serviceable location or a community anchor institution that's identified by the state. That's going to be also represented. There are going to be lists that are going to be shared, and it's also going to be shared on the Illinois BEAD challenge map. So there's 2 ways of basically going about this process. One would be to directly go to the BEAD challenge map. So this, we have a few screenshots here. Again, this is still in development. We're going to have future webinars that go into specifics of the step-by-step process of interacting with the map. But it has features like you can select one or multiple locations, basically use a lasso tool to select multiple locations, or just hit shift on your keyboard and select multiple locations that you might want to challenge. And that directly takes the broadband serviceable location ID, the location ID, to the challenge portal so that you can complete the rest of the process there. This is mostly recommended for nonprofits and local units of government that might not already have access to the fabric, so you don't necessarily have the location IDs handy. So just selecting locations on the map is going to help make that transition and take that data along to the portal so that you can continue the process there. And the second option is if you already have access to the fabric, which has all of those location IDs for broadband serviceable locations across the state, you can directly aggregate all of that into a CSV with all the other required fields and then proceed to submission on the portal. So you can still apply for a FCC Fabric license. Again, it's not required because the state is coming up with a tool that can help even if you don't have access to it. But if you'd still be interested in, like, analyzing the data yourself, that might be a good option. We had links on how to go about that process. In this slide, looking at the additional challenge types, so the area challenge and the MDU challenge. As I mentioned in all of these, once this is triggered, it's going to reverse the burden of proof for availability, speed, latency, data caps, and technology, or those categories onto the provider, who's been challenged. So for an area challenge, if there are 6 or more BSLs using a particular technology and a single provider within a census block group, that is when an area challenge is going to be triggered. And similarly for MDUs, it's a little bracketed into categories based on the number of units that an MDU might have. So if there's 1 or more units in an MDU with less than 15 units, that would trigger an MDU challenge. And again, it's going to be on the provider to make sure that they can provide evidence that they serve all the units at that particular location. If the MDU has 16 to 24 units, we'd want at least 2 or more units to challenge a particular provider and technology so that an MDU challenge is activated. And if an MDU has greater than 25 units, we'd want 3 or more units to actually challenge a particular provider and technology to have the challenge type triggered. And these would also count towards area challenge. So towards the end of the challenge phase is when we're going to aggregate a lot of this data and see if it would trigger any of these challenges and accordingly send out communications to providers. And now if we have Alexis joining us, I'd like to turn over the mic to her so that she can share a little bit more about the speed test requirements.
Hello, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to the types of challenges that people can make. So one of the challenge types that was discussed throughout the webinar process for the last couple of weeks has been the option to submit a speed test. And there are tricky ways that the speed test rules are written, and going through them one by one to make sure that everyone understands them, I think will be helpful to make sure that we have a lot of successful speed test challenges posted to the map. So first and foremost, how do we submit a speed test? The NTIA rules state that we must submit 3 speed tests on 3 separate days and save a screenshot, PDF, or image of a speed test, including the date and time of the test and your IP address. Second, attest the speed you subscribe to or gather a copy of your internet bill that shows your name and address and the speed that you subscribe to. What types of speed tests are available? So I'm sure some of you have had a day where you feel like your internet is really frustrating, or you get new internet service and you want to go and check out what you're getting. So you Google speed test and a proprietary service like Ookla comes up and you run a speed test and the little meter goes back and forth and you get your reading. So some of you are probably very familiar with Ookla, MLab, Open Speed Test. Cloudflare is one of them, and Netflix has a speed test called fast.com. And these are the speed tests that NTIA has approved for the use in the speed test challenge. So once again, this seems like a lot of steps. Remember, we have to first and foremost do our speed tests on 3 separate days. You got to save the screenshot of that speed test with that information in it, date and time of the test, your IP address in that screen clip, and then you must attest to the speed that you subscribe to gather a copy of your internet bill that shows your name and address and the speed that you subscribe to. So this is another kind of sticky point that if you happen to be in a community organization and you would like to communicate to folks how they can find this information, sometimes it's a little tricky to find what speed tier people subscribe to. In particular, if you go into your app and you're looking around, you might actually have to reach out to customer service to double check the speed tier that you subscribe to in case you don't. So this is a basic overview of the speed test challenge portion. Now, if you could go to the next slide. So a team of researchers at the Internet Equity Initiative at the University of Chicago actually created a speed test tool specifically for the Illinois BEAD challenge. And what this speed test tool aims to do is lower barriers to entry by being a data aggregator themselves. So the Internet Equity Initiative has the speed test challenge portal where you can go in and test your speed and enter the important information required by NTIA in order to have a successful challenge. And then and then the University of Chicago researchers will actually use the information that you submit and submit a challenge on your behalf. And forgive me if I am hesitating. There is a Google Fiber salesman at my door right now, knocking on my door and ringing my doorbell multiple times. So you'll have to forgive my attention here. This person will not go away. So I'm going to share my screen right now and demo the tool. Forgive the interruption here. I really wish this internet salesman would go away. It is very interesting how funny life is in some instances that way. So I'm going to share my screen, and here is the speed test tool created for the purposes of BEAD speed testing in the state of Illinois. Now, remember, this is not the required speed test tool. This tool is built to lower barriers to entry and also be a way that individuals can challenge their speeds and not have to worry about grabbing that screen clip or submitting their information through a third-party organization that has to then submit again. So what you'll do is you'll come to beadchallenge.org right there, and this is what it looks like. And you'll go to hit start on the open speed test. And I actually, I'm at a location in Austin, Texas right now on a little bit of a vacation. So I have a fiber to the home connection here. So my speeds are actually pretty fast. So we'll see what we get. Now, while we're waiting for the results of this, it is best practices to be as close to your router, your Wi-Fi router, as you can be when you are running these speed tests. Also, it's very important to remember if you happen to be running a VPN, you need to disable your VPN in order to have an accurate speed test. So now that my speed test is completed, I can see that I have a pretty high download speed and a pretty high upload speed indicative of a fiber connection. If for some reason my speeds were very slow, I would actually see this message pop up. Attention, poor internet performance has been detected in your last measurement. To make sure this measurement informs your community's eligibility for funding and is reflected on the Illinois Broadband Map, fill in your address, zip code, and email below and submit the results for analysis. So we're going to go back to the speed test website here. And as you can see, there's a little arrow down at the bottom that shows you the full instructions. And there's a breakdown. What is a speed test? Why should I take a speed test? What is this tool? You'll notice that if you hover, the Spanish language pops up as well. What happens after I submit my speed test? And this is what I would like to focus on right here. So if you enter in your first name, last name, email, zip code, and if you hit the Get My Location button, your street address will automatically populate right here. Remember that step where I asked or I overviewed the fact that you need to know what speed tier you subscribe to in order to be able to have a successful challenge? Well, right here is where you'll put your download speed and your upload speed. So I know at my house in Austin that I subscribe to 1 gigabit service. And just like a kilometer is 1,000 meters, 1,000 megabits is 1 gigabit, which is what I subscribe to. So I'm going to enter into that as my speed, enter my name and get my location and hit the submit button. Hitting submit will trigger an email being sent to your inbox saying that you have indeed completed the speed test. And then what we will do is we will email you to remind you to take the speed test 3 times in a row. You can opt out to get emails if you actually don't want to participate. And we will email you up to 20 times if you need that many reminders. And then we will stop emailing you after 20 times to stop reminding you. And importantly, it's important to note the policy notice says that in order for us to be able to submit and challenge speeds in the state of Illinois, that we need to provide the state of Illinois with your name, your email, your internet service provider, your location, and all of those other required bits of information in order to submit a successful challenge. And this is what this is explaining right now. First and foremost, I want everybody to know that we are extremely committed to privacy, and none of this information will be sold or shared with anyone other than the state of Illinois broadband map and the provider who will get your information in order to make the situation better. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass the mic to whomever comes next.
Thanks, Alexis. That was super helpful. The live demonstration as well. And I think just want to reiterate for the folks on the call that this is helpful just because you wouldn't have to go through, taking the speed test thrice yourself and then, screenshotting it, keeping recording all of that, and then sharing it with a local profit, local nonprofit or local unit of government. So this basically helps, really streamline the process for you. All you have to do is respond to the reminders and take the test thrice. So super helpful tool. Thank you so much for that. Again, the other ways of taking the speed test are an option if that's something that you're interested in, but this could just help streamline the process for you. In the next slide, really talking about, and I know we're kind of running late on time. We also want to have time for questions. So I'm going to be brief with some of this information here. So CSV formats for bulk submissions, as we know that individuals can most likely, participate through their local units of government and nonprofits. We'd want to share resources that can help streamline that data collection and aggregation process for participating units of government and nonprofits. So we're going to be sharing templates for each of the challenge types soon. And there's also going to be instructions available on the Illinois Office of Broadband website and the challenge portal. But just to give you a sense of what sort of data is going to be needed, it's essentially going to be the challenge type, the location details, that would include the location ID. Now, again, you wouldn't necessarily have to have that from the very beginning. You can get that through the BEAD challenge map that we're developing or through the FCC fabric if you have access to that. Also information on the name of the provider and the technology that they're providing at that location, and then the evidence for the specific challenge type that we had discussed in the previous slides. So moving on to next steps, as Devin had highlighted and shared about the pre-registration, We have a link to the pre-registration form here as well. We would encourage ISPs, local governments, and nonprofits to register by 12th of January. So that is before we are anticipating starting the BEAD challenge process. And for residents, you can already will be sharing these slides, and the email that Nancy shares will also put in a link to the BEAD challenge tool that Alexis had just shared. So you can very well start to take these speed test challenges, and those can be part of what U of Chicago shares with the state as part of the BEAD challenge process. As I had mentioned, there's going to be the BEAD challenge map. So stay tuned for more information and updates on that. The anticipated date for release of that map is first week of 8th of January. So that's when we're planning on having that released. And definitely regularly check the Illinois Office of Broadband and the Illinois Broadband Lab websites for updates. Additional information about the challenge process. So we have a link here on the Illinois Office of Broadband website, which has a federal broadband tab. So this is where you can find most of the documents that we have referenced to in this presentation today, the Connect Illinois BEAD Initial Proposal Volume 1. And we also had a previous, so for anybody who's been following our webinars, there was also one in October. There was one last week, which also previewed some of these requirements and processes around the BEAD challenge process. So those would be places to look out for more information. If you have other questions, we have our email address here, but now we'll also get to questions that we've been receiving in the chat.
Thank you, Shabika. One of the early questions that we had early on was asking if there was a way to verify the registration, and just wanted to let everyone know Devin did answer that question and said that if she can get an email from anyone who needs to verify that registration, they can contact her at devin.bronstein@illinois.gov, and her email's there in the chat. And so thank you for addressing that question, Devin. Next question was if there was more specific guidance on what would be acceptable evidence for the, quote, lack of suitable infrastructure, unquote, within an MDU.
Yes, so I think this would be under the availability challenge category. Well, we might have to check with our friends at NTIA, but I'm wondering if maybe a photo showing the lack of fiber or lack of technology may qualify. Not sure if anyone's on who can answer that.
Right. I think we'll need some, more guidance from NTIA in terms of what exactly could qualify. But I think, as Devin mentioned, that could be good. And again, the idea is that we want to make sure that every unit in the MDU gets access to the service that's reported for that location. So if there's any kind of evidence that, again, speed tests, or basically when we're talking about suitable infrastructure, that could be photos essentially that show that. But we'll get back with specifics on this.
Okay, and so if anybody does have a question on that acceptable evidence for lack of infrastructure that they want to contact NTIA for, would that be to Greg Klaus that they put those questions to, or do you want to be a part of those conversations as well?
I think we just want it easier for folks to get their answers. So if you can just share it to the broadband@illinois.gov email address, and we'll be sure to follow up with NTIA and get back to you so that you don't have to go to multiple people and get your answers. That would be my recommendation. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll also be aggregating all of the questions from the last few webinars and posting responses online. So if something is in the weeds and we need to take some time to look it up, we'll make sure to share out where it is so everyone has the same consistent information.
Okay. And of course, if we can put that email address as well in the chat for the Illinois Broadband Lab once more. That would be great. Next question is, Can an ISP, internet service provider, challenge an area or location that appears on the Illinois Broadband website map as served, but is actually unserved with no fiber? And in the same challenge, make a build-out proposal for the same location?
Hi, Nancy. I can take that question. I would say that we're standing up this interactive map that we showed you a screenshot of, so that folks can look at it, see what available service is reflected in the broadband map, and challenge it accordingly. However, if there is a provider that, for instance, is under an enforceable agreement and that's not reflected in the map, there's an opportunity for that provider to update the map per that enforceable agreement. Otherwise, if we're talking about future, deployments for which there is not an enforceable commitment, it really needs to very likely take the form of an application to the BEAD program, or investment that's taking place and that is being updated to the FCC fabric. We just need to have essentially the data provided to the state through this mapping challenge process, or that continued engagement with the FCC and the fabric. And so I would just encourage folks, they're almost kind of two separate processes here. Look at the map, where things stand now, whether it's current access or deployment that's underway, or an enforceable agreement that is in place. Otherwise, if you're a provider looking to take on some of the map and you'd like to turn an unserved or underserved area into served, then that's very likely going to be through the application process through the BEAD program itself, which the state will be administering, Connect Illinois Round 4. I hope I split that question in a helpful way.
Thank you. There is, with the discussion around the different types of challenges, there was a question in the chat about the minimum number of challenge submissions that could be required. The example here was a nonprofit that submits only one, and the question over whether that would still be valid. Devin, you had answered that and said that there is no minimum and that one challenge can be submitted. So thank you for doing that, for answering that question. The next question we had was asking if everyone should pre-register as a matter of course. And this could be a question on eligible entities as well, but Devin answers this, that saying it doesn't hurt to register. In the event that anyone would want to participate, it's better to be registered. Any other sort of comments from anyone on this question about the pre-registration? And so then we've got a few more questions here, and thanks everyone for getting those questions in. So how much time will be available to submit the challenges? If there's an entire area that is affected, can you submit a challenge for an area instead of a single address?
The quick answer is yes, there's an opportunity for an area challenge. And so I think when we talk about the timing here, let's just review. The map is going to be posted in early January. It will be made available for at least a week before the mapping challenge process starts. And then when that process starts, we plan on having the challenge process itself open for 2 to 4 weeks, with the rebuttal period that follows similarly open 2 to 4 weeks. A lot of this is contingent upon when we get approval from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. There are nuances to an area-wide challenge versus a specific location challenge, but I will say that if you look at the interactive map that we are establishing, that we will be able to demo here next week, there is an opportunity for either selecting on an individual address and having that location ID and BSL follow you into the portal, or lassoing multiple locations and collecting the relevant data, which would follow into the portal for a submission of a challenge. And so you can do it either way, location by location or broader area challenges. And again, there is some nuance with that area challenge. I don't know, Shabik, if you'd like to add anything to that, but I think that hopefully will help the questioner.
Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well, Matt.
Yes, and to that also, Devin had mentioned there's a lasso function, that sort of idea where you can draw around an area to select multiple locations on the broadband challenge map. And if I have to put a guess out there, I would think there's some demo in the future that will be provided.
That's right.
Another question here. The challenge is location-based. The assumption that the challenge is location-based in all cases. So does that mean that every location that we believe is incorrect will have to be challenged to be changed? In other words, may we get only some locations challenged and others in that area may still show incorrect data?
The quick answer here is this. We can have a broader area challenge where a subset of the locations has evidence provided associated with them, and the findings could apply to the broader area. But wherever we can, we really want to try to match specific evidence with specific locations. And so that is going to be the strongest evidence that can be submitted to us. And the state's in a position where we will give providers an opportunity to rebut any challenges that we receive, and then we will adjudicate and make a decision. And so I would just say, to the extent that you as a challenger can provide as much location-specific evidence as possible, you're going to make, I think, the likelihood of your challenge being accepted stronger.
Thank you. And there was a later question that asked about the gathering data for on beadchallenge.org, and if this is only valid during a certain time window. I'm guessing this is in regards to that January window, and so that question's already been answered. So thanks for that, and wanted to skip to a question about local government being informed that a commitment or planned service challenge has been done, so that some interaction can be sort of given to those, perhaps a rebuttal or something. So is there any way that local governments are informed or notified about any of those challenges that might be submitted? And then I'll ask the next part of that question after this.
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to stress is we'd like to engage local governments, nonprofits, other stakeholders, including our providers, as closely and consistently as we can throughout this. I mean, this is a great opportunity to lock in the map in a most accurate way. And so one thing I would say is this: if you're a local government in particular and you want to look at your jurisdiction, you're going to be able to use our mapping tool that is being stood up right now, and go in there and be able to discern, all right, what locations are served according to the data, which ones are unserved or underserved, but also which ones have enforceable commitments. And if you have questions about anything that the data is suggesting to you, you can either participate in the mapping challenge process formally, or reach out to our office and in the colleagues we have at the Broadband Lab, for a conversation about what it means and what's going on. And so I would just really stress that. Let's be conversational about what the data is showing, put you in a position to understand it and be effective and challenging. And I think there's certainly an opportunity for us to share, the challenges that are received, not only with providers, but with a broader segment of the stakeholder group in Illinois. So let's circle back on that one and talk about what that might look like. But again, I want to stress, this is an important opportunity for local governments and other stakeholders, and we want to put you in a position to understand what's going on and follow us every step of the way. So if there's a pointed question about how you can be effective or informed, let us know.
Thanks. And another question on what does unreasonable mean with respect to data gaps? Does subscription cost factor into this?
I'd like to open that up to a couple of my colleagues. I saw that question in the chat box. I'm not 100% certain I got the context down for that. Shubika or Devin or Alexis?
I think it's around data caps, and I'm just looking at the footnote here from the FCC. An unreasonable capacity allowance is defined as a data cap that falls below the monthly capacity allowance of 600 gigabytes. So it sounds like that's the official definition of it, but we'll take that back to just double check.
Sure. Okay, so let's move on to the next question here. Is the University of Chicago BEADchallenge.org going to challenge for Illinois only or for all states?
Yeah, so the purpose of the research tool was really to help our neighbors and friends in the state of Illinois, but it is our developer is actually on the call, very talented gentleman named Guillermo Martins. He built it to be open source and fully vetted by the NTIA. We have actually spoken with the BEAD technical assistance team as well. And so it could indeed be developed and used for other organizations, states, or people in general who are looking to utilize an open source tool. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
And Nancy, if I could just add to that, just in terms of how we're looking at this challenge process, we know there's a lot going on the broadband and digital equity fronts right now. And this mapping challenge process is really important for helping us lock in the map for use of BEAD funds. But I think it's also important to continue this conversation with stakeholders, local governments, providers, nonprofits, and Illinoisans. And so we anticipate reopening this process later this spring, and allowing all the stakeholders I just mentioned to continue to engage with us on perfecting the map. And I think that there's a lot of benefits to this. I think it's always important for us to measure where broadband is and is not. And as our grant program, Connect Illinois, continues to make investments around the state, and as the BEAD program takes off in full and makes investments, we want to be able to track where those investments are being effective and maybe where they're falling short. And so I think it's important for folks to stay engaged on the mapping front. And so hopefully you look at that as an opportunity. We've got a couple of months here, January and February, where we are able to lock in the BEAD map, but there's also a great opportunity for using the tools that we're standing up right now for other benefits down the road.
Thanks. And there was another question around the date and time on the results for the BEADchallenge.org site. And so there was a response about the timestamp being recorded along with the performance of results. Didn't know if anybody wanted to chime in about that or on what the implications for that is.
Yeah, and I can hop in with this, and you'll have to forgive me. I was so flustered by the Google Fiber salesman knocking at my door that I failed to mention that indeed your email will have the pertinent information that is gathered by the BEAD challenge, speed test challenge tool. So a timestamp is also necessary and will be included in that piece of data as well in the email. So yes, all of the information that is required that's laid out in the updated BEAD speed test requirement document has indeed been built into the portal. So we really, really wanted this to be as accessible as possible. I know someone mentioned in the chat that oftentimes folks who are underserved or unserved don't have, a stable address or facilities, or might be moving from place to place. And we also took into consideration mobile dependent people, if people are using their cell phone and what it looks like on a mobile device. So really, indeed, it was intended to do all of the work and just have people click a simple button and kind of input the information, and then we would clean it and then send that to the map to improve the map. So yes, thank you for that great question. And once again, I apologize. I want to find that Google Fiber salesman and show them what I was doing.
Thank you. There's a question around internet service providers who are going to submit a challenge to declare new deployment that might not be reflected on the map. Is that an availability type, challenge type, or what type of challenge would they do?
That would be a planned service challenge type. And again, it has its guidelines in terms of deployment should be made by June 30th, 2024. But if there is construction that's already happening, you have all the permits that are needed to go ahead with that, you would file a planned service challenge.
Okay, thank you. Does the challenge tool differentiate between wired and other sources of internet like fixed wireless? And we have an answer here, but let me put that to the panel.
Well, just real quick, I mean, what we're trying to do is establish whether or not an area is served, underserved, or unserved, per the BEAD specifications. And so that means the service is either, wired, through fiber, for instance. There's a wireless connection using licensed spectrum. In any event, if it's 100 by 20 or greater megabits per second, to those specs, it would be considered served. If it's below 25 by 3 to those specs, it would be unserved. And if it's in between, it's underserved. And so different technologies can be used to accomplish those goals and to categorize the service accordingly. But to your question, it really kind of boils down to the performance and not necessarily the technology.
Thank you. What happens if you qualify for challenge requirements? Is there improvement to internet infrastructure funding to the community anchor institution or individual, et cetera, to fix themselves, et cetera? There is a nice answer here from Devin that specifies that if a location qualifies as unserved or underserved, it would be prioritized for next year's broadband development, and that once the map is finalized, the next step is opening up the process for broadband providers to submit applications to invest in technology, which will bring unserved, underserved locations to the served level, which is 100 by 20 megabits per second or higher. In short, for BEAD specifically, the funding goes towards improving internet infrastructure. So thank you, Devin, for that. Want to see if there's any other input from the panel on that question.
Great question, great response. I think that the quick, point I want to emphasize here is this is the first time that all of us have had a chance to influence a map, lock it in, and then obligate ourselves to connecting those unserved and underserved locations. And also, this is the first time ever, really, that community anchor institutions are part of the conversation, elevating their needs and making sure that we're taking stock of where their service is and is not. So absolutely, the stakes are high in a very, very good way.
If I could just also add, so this funding source is specific to technology and infrastructure, but you'll hear a lot more about the Digital Equity Act will contribute to some of the other things you listed, like support for community-based organizations to help folks get connected.
Thank you. And as you all have probably noticed, as long as we have questions, I'm going to keep moving unless I get some sort of flag from the panel that they'd like me to provide a facilitated stop here. Otherwise, we're going to keep on rolling. And I appreciate everyone staying on for a thorough discussion. The next question is, many of our underserved are highly mobile. They are renters or they move quickly, couch surf, etc., sometimes homeless, and the addresses are not reliable often. What are your ideas for this? And there was a nice response by Devin provided that any location on the map can be challenged. For a speed test, a renter can participate by taking 3 separate tests on 3 different days. An easy way to do this is by visiting the beadchallenge.org website. We're also developing materials and instructions specifically for target audiences like individuals and community organizations. It's a complex process, but we're working to make it as accessible as we can. And I'd like to add kind of a caveat to this. It can be in a question form, but really when folks are moving around and submitting speed tests from different locations, should they be using just their regular device in with the connectivity being from a fixed wireless local internet source, or is their data plan and their mobile data with the signal that they use from the cell towers? Can you provide a little bit of guidance on what should be done before the speed tests are taken?
I would open that up to my colleagues. Alexis, Shabika, you want to comment?
I think as Alexis mentioned during the demo that she was sharing for the BEAD Challenge tool there, one of the best practices would be being closest to your router when you're taking the test, just to make sure that's like the highest speed that you're receiving and that's recorded. But other than that, not really. But again, we can get back to you with any other guidance that we may have on that. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think if people are using their cell phone and don't have a laptop computer and they would like to measure their wired connection using their in-home network, they have to ensure that they're on their wireless network and that they're not on their cellular network. If they happen to be cellular dependent, let's say, for example, I grew up in Wisconsin and lots of folks have cabins up in the Northwoods. And so a lot of those places don't actually have wired internet service. And it also might be very expensive to have a year-round contract. So people may use hotspots in that case. So if you're connected to your hotspot on your cell phone, just make sure that you're on that cellular hotspot connection. So you just have to do a little data checking to make sure that you are on the network that you would like to be on and to measure.
Thanks. I just wanted to address that because I think a lot of folks, as they're trying to gauge what the speeds are in their communities and different neighborhoods, that really makes a big difference to know that you should be connected to the local fixed internet, a router, and so not using cellular or hotspot for those speed tests because we're trying to measure performance on infrastructure. Question here in your example, you subscribe to 1,000 by 1,000, but I suspect you're on a Wi-Fi connection in your house and thus 500 by 600 speeds. What happens if a resident subscribes to 100 by 100, but their test via Wi-Fi and at a distance from the router, the test comes up 75 by 75. That address may be deemed eligible when in fact the house is receiving 100 by 100 or better, but the actions of the individual and the house layout is really the issue. Does an internet service provider just need to show that the speed they provide is at the ONT? Shubika had sort of addressed this in saying get as close to your router as possible when taking the speed test. And does anyone else want to provide any guidance? There was another great response here from Alexis about the BEAD speed test policy guidance that's provided, and she pasted that there. There is guidance. If you're listening to this recording, there's BEAD speed test policy guidance that you'd want to refer to in order to properly do those speed tests. Yes, Alexis.
That's correct. Actually, indeed, thanks for pointing that out. So that policy guidance has just been updated, and I received it from our wonderful FPO, Greg Klaus, and it is a one-pager that explains how both end users and ISPs who may be rebutting what rules those are. And indeed, I have to, confess to everyone that I do come from the wired network measurement side of things. And so we know that there are discrepancies and router issues or proximity to the wireless router might impact speed tests. And that's why NTIA is actually asking people to take them on 3 separate days. And also, if you look, the ISP guidance for rebuttal has a window of error in which they are expected to take measurements. So NTIA is well aware that these measurements are going to vary and has provided guidance for every person engaging in the process on how to not only capture the data, but make the assessments. And I'm going to repeat the mantra once again. First and foremost, get as close to your wireless router as possible. If you have a wired connection or an Ethernet connection, that's those yellow cords that look a little bit like an old school phone cord. They're a little bit fatter and they have a little clear plastic lever on them. An Ethernet cord to plug into your router gateway and your computer also can help. as well as turning off your VPN if you use a VPN, because that will route you to servers far, far away. So make sure you turn off your VPN, and also make sure that you're on the network that you intend to measure. So you don't want to be on your Verizon cell phone plan if what you really want to measure is your wired connection. So that's best practices. And I think that the state broadband office can probably share that one pager out with the larger group.
Wonderful. And I want to thank everyone for their participation. There's several remaining questions here, but I'm actually needing to be mindful of the time and availability of our panelists. So we will fold these questions into next week's Q&A. And just a reminder that next week is really an overview and a revisit of what was covered this week and last week. So we really want to encourage you to attend at this time next week for another webinar where this will continue to get reiterated and the conversation can continue. Want to just give a quick opportunity to our panel to give any sort of lasting remarks and takeaway, and then I will close out the webinar.
Well, thanks a lot, Nancy, and thanks everybody for your interest in this topic. Again, a great opportunity for all of us to improve the maps that will drive future investment and help us achieve universal connectivity around the state. And so just reach out if you got any questions, comments, concerns. We want to put you all in a position to be effective participants in this process. Devin, Shabika, Alexis, anything you'd like to add?
No, just thanks everyone, and we're excited to dig into kind of advice, guidance, materials for how folks can engage in the process. So stay tuned for that. And if you do have specific ideas on how to best serve residents, underserved areas, disinvested areas, don't hesitate to reach out with your suggestions.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add thank you so much for the questions, because yeah, we're just definitely sharing the first guidance on the different types of ways you can start to like engage and the evidence types. But I think the discussion was super helpful in terms of getting into the weeds of what's really required as you start to think of this. So thank you so much. Looking forward to connecting next week as well. Meanwhile, if you have any specific questions, feel free to, send them to the email address that we've already shared. So thanks.
Thank you again to the panel. Thanks to the participants for their engagement today. I hope to see everybody here next week who needs to be here, and we look forward to having another program with you then. Hope everyone has a great rest of their week, and take care.
Thanks, Nancy.